This is a true story that took place during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it was the first time the Soviet Union had dispatched multiple warships in an offensive formation to Swedish waters. Sweden, in response, deployed its only submarine and several coastal guns aimed at the border, with both sides on the brink of a major conflict. The reason the situation became so tense was not to Soviet aggression, but because a Soviet submarine equipped with torpedoes had triggered a crisis. Approximately 3 days prior, a Soviet submarine en route to Kaliningrad had its captain grant the crew several hours of leave to bid farewell to a lieutenant about to retire, allowing them to celebrate freely inside the submarine. Upon hearing this news, the crew members, who had been on high alert for an extended period, retrieved their personal supplies of Ford and began a wild party inside the submarine. As a result of this brief period of relaxation, the most senior officer made a mistake while planning the submarine's route. According to the original plan, they were supposed to sail to the port of Klaipėda in Lithuania. They would disembark the refugee retired lieutenant. However, shortly after the submarine set off, suddenly changed course midway. At that moment, the crew members were still continuing their wild celebration and completely failed to notice that the submarine had deviated from its intended destination. This continued for several hours until suddenly, the submarine experienced a violent shaking, throwing everyone inside around. Once the submarine stabilized, the drunk crew members thought they had arrived at the port of Klaipėda. However, they later discovered that the submarine had actually run aground near an island. Fortunately, the submarine was not damaged. Even so, the captain was still greatly alarmed. He immediately ordered all crew members to return to their stations and attempted to maneuver the submarine out the sand. However, after multiple attempts, the submarine remained motionless. With no other options, the captain could only notify higher authorities and request assistance. However, the prerequisite is that they must know their current location. Therefore, upon entering the boat, the captain immediately located the navigator responsible for planning the route. The navigator off the coast of Sweden. Upon hearing that they had stranded in another country, the captain nearly lost his temper with the navigator. Even so, it couldn't change the fact that they were currently off the coast of Sweden. There was no other option. The captain eventually instructed the communications officer to send a distress signal to Moscow. However, the message stated that the submarine had entered Swedish due to a navigation system malfunction, which could lead to diplomatic complications. Soon, this information reached the Kremlin in Moscow. Upon learning of the situation, Brezhnev flew into a rage, demanding to know what these officials were doing. To shift the blame, the officials claimed they had been conducting a group island operation exercise and everything was proceeding according to plan, unaware of the time. The submarine changed it and headed toward Kaliningrad, eventually entering the territorial waters of another country. In fact, they currently have no idea what the situation is. However, the only thing that can be confirmed at this point is that the submarine has now run aground in the Swedish archipelago. Upon hearing this, Brezhnev ordered them to immediately send a fleet to rescue it. As for the submarine captain, he will face military trial. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Ronald Reagan, the president whose image was being used for entertainment purposes with Brezhnev's portrait, received intelligence from the general. He believed that the Soviet Union was preparing to attack Sweden because the Soviet Union had a submarine had already entered the vicinity of a Swedish naval base. President Reagan initially thought the submarine was carrying squid, but the general later stated that they also unsure at the moment. To clarify the truth, President Reagan ordered his staff to immediately bring him back to the White House. He wanted to discuss the matter with the Swedish Prime Minister was on a direct call when the submarine's captain suddenly noticed 2 Swedish jet fighters roaring overhead. It was clear that the Swedish pilots had spotted them. The information was quickly relayed to the Ministry of Defense. Some believed that the Soviet submarine had entered the area without permission. Military restricted zone. This was an unprovoked act of aggression. Others speculated that it might have been a mistake on the part of the Soviets, but the defense minister stated that regardless of intent, any unauthorized entry into their territorial waters justified taking necessary measures. He had already dispatched 4 torpedo boats, which were now in on the submarine. Location. As soon as the Prime Minister ordered to analyze the situation first and see what happens. Just as they were reviewing the photos taken by the patrol aircraft, the secretary suddenly reported that a large number of media personnel were waiting outside for the Prime Minister. At the same time, President Reagan and Brezhnev's phone also rang in the office. Upon hearing the news, the Prime Minister was momentarily unsure whom to respond first. Ultimately, considering that neither leader spoke Swedish, the Prime Minister decided to meet with the media first. At the Kremlin in Moscow, Brezhnev, who had a penchant for drinking, took a large sip of vodka. He received a call from President Ronald Reagan. Originally, the two were rivals who refused to yield to each other. Had it not been for the interpreter in the communication room mediating between them, they would likely erupted into a heated argument. After exchanging provocative remarks, Brezhnev grew tired of engaging in verbal banter and ordered, "Don't follow me and get provoked." By his words, After being provoked verbally, Brezhnev directly ordered the fleet to enter Swedish waters and forcibly rescue the stranded submarine. Soon, Admiral Garyini of the Soviet fleet near the Swedish border received Brezhnev's order to attack. The fleet immediately adopted an offensive formation and headed toward the Swedish border, while the Swedish War Command Center, upon receiving news of the Soviet fleet's attack, the commander did not particularly panicked. He immediately ordered his men to deploy coastal artillery, even when they reported they had no ammunition. Soon, the Soviet fleet was only 189 meters from the border, and it would take approximately 4 minutes to cross the border. At this point, the cannons along the Swedish coast were also ready. Additionally, the Neptune-class submarine had already arrived beneath the Soviet fleet. To alert the Soviets its presence, they deliberately activated the submarine's floodlights. However, despite this, the Soviet fleet commander remained unconcerned and ordered the fleet to maintain its course. As the fleet approached the border, the Swedish commander ordered his men to switch communications to frequency hopping. It is important to note that frequency hopping is only used in actual warfare. It was clear that the Swedish commander had taken it to the extreme. He was certain that the Soviet fleet would not fire without provocation. Soon, the Soviet fleet discovered the switch. When they saw this situation, the Soviet fleet commander couldn't believe it. After weighing the pros and cons, the Swedish commander finally ordered the entire fleet to stop.